Hello, Star Wars Indiana here with another episode of the Star Wars Alternate History. Sorry, got confused. Anyways, today's episode is going to be a kind of sequel to an earlier episode, which was about what Star Wars created in the 1980s. But instead, today's question is on what Star Wars was created in the 1960s. So there's a lot less to go on here compared to the 1980s because this is simply saying, what if it was created a decade earlier, sometime in the 1960s? We have a better idea of the effects of Star Wars in the 1980s and what could have happened if it was created later. But it's more difficult to tell what would happen if it happened earlier. So I'm not going to be telling the effects more, but of what could be its significance. But I'm more simply going to be stating what Star Wars itself would likely be like, and not the culture, or if it would have any impact on the culture like Star Wars has had in our present timeline. So, one of the major things you have to take into Star Wars' success and why it was so successful is because of the historical stresses leading up to 1977. So, first off, in the United States, especially, you have the civil rights movement, which is building up during the whole 60s up till 1968 and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in the beginning of that year. Then you also have the building up of the Vietnam up through the 60s under LBJ and the assassination of JFK. And then Vietnam continues. And in 1968, you have the Tet Offensive in January. Then you have the assassination of Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, later that year before the Democratic Convention. You have LBJ saying he's not going to run again. All these confounding factors go into it. And then the 70s, you have Watergate scandal under Nixon, which throws the public awry, and the first Speaker of House becomes president, Gerald Ford. And then you have the OPEC oil crisis and the several other crises going on, but the OPEC oil crisis caused an economic depression, which all sets up for Star Wars to be a successful movie, because Star Wars is going to do exactly what movies did in the 1930s during the Great Depression. It's going to take people out of that funk that the country had been in for 15, 20 years. This funk isn't necessarily there in the 60s. 60s looked at as like this hippie time and whatnot. Not necessarily sad or bad time, not necessarily down, but at the same time, not necessarily happy time either. But these stresses haven't been building up for as long yet, especially if this were released exactly 10 years earlier in 1967. You don't have 1968, which was a major year in U.S. history. You don't have the two assassins and LBJ and the Tet Offensive and the disastrous Democratic Convention happening. So those are historical stresses, and you don't have that lack of them leading up to the movie to allow it to be successful, to take people out of the world, essentially. Now, the next thing, and should be most obvious, is George Lucas is not going to be an experienced filmmaker. In fact, I think he may have even been a student at this point. For example, he would have not made American Graffiti yet. That was a successful movie he released in 1973. So he's not going to have these successes. He's not going to have built up this knowledge of the world yet. And there's no way he could actually produce and write as good of a movie. For example, he's going to have a lack of even some cultural influences that came later in the 60s that may not have happened if it was released 10 years earlier or a little bit earlier than that, some other time in the 60s, that wouldn't have affected it or have affected the way he produced Star Wars in some other way, making a very different movie. For example, science fiction has not been repopularized yet or popularized. It really became popular in the late 60s. It started becoming popular in the early 60s, like in the United Kingdom where they had Doctor Who, but especially in the late 60s with the release of Star Trek in 2001 A Space Odyssey, science fiction started becoming popular again. Now, Star Wars took a different twist on science fiction, making it feel like a lived in world, but that's different. At this point, science fiction isn't even super popular yet, and most movies are based around different thoughts, different cultural things happening, and World War II movies are still coming out, stuff like that. You don't have science fiction as a major point in movies. You don't have pop culture movies, essentially. So, that's one major thing. The other thing is there are other cultural influences that may not have worked their way in yet either that allowed George Lucas to do that. And also, quite a bit of the movies George Lucas produced were also based off of these historical influences that were happening during the 60s and 70s. So when you have these lack of historical stresses, you also have these lack of historical references that George Lucas isn't able to use in his writing, such as the Ewoks are like a reference to the Vietnam War. So you have a lack of that. And then another big thing is a lack of new technologies. The 60s is an expansive time for new technology with the space race, which probably ended up going over into the movie industry a bit. But you have other technologies that likely came about outside of the space race as well. All of these may have contributed. I don't know any specific technologies. I'm just making assumptions. Now, this doesn't mean they couldn't have had the same special effects and everything. They could have. I don't know if the technologies they used in producing the movie were similar to ones in the 1970s or not. So, uh, that's just one thing I want to make sure to take into account. So, one other thing is with the success of this movie, what's going to happen? Is it going to be a successful movie? Well, Star Wars, if it were released in the 60s, would likely still be successful. Not a giant blockbuster hit. Not almost rivaling uh, Gone with the Wind for one of the top box office hits of all time based on inflation. Uh, but it'll still be a successful movie, but it will come with a very different story. Probably even different from the original The Star Wars, which I've never read, but it was the original script George Lucas wrote. And likely be even different from that if it were released in the 60s. And you also have a lack of it likely creating this sense of pop culture that led into movies such as E.T. and Indiana Jones and Aliens, all these other movies that came out in the 80s, Terminator. So you have this lack of creating that pop culture go along with it, and then you also wouldn't have things being successful such as a toy line. They could have marketed a toy line correctly, I guess, like they did with Star Wars in the 70s through Kenner. But at the same time, you may not have a successful toy line coming out 10 years earlier. Marvel Comics were still successful back in the 60s. They didn't need to look into comics like Star Wars, and Marvel may not have even taken up a Star Wars comic deal in the 60s like they did in the 70s, which actually saved Marvel. So, Marvel may not be around if it, in this case either. I probably said that when I was talking about the 80s. So, would Star Wars be successful? Yes, it'd probably still be successful in the 60s because 2001: A Space Odyssey was successful, Star Trek was successful, and Doctor Who were successful science fictions that came out in the 60s. Would it be the same story that we all know and love? There is no way this would be the same story we all know and love. Now, if George Lucas came out with it in the 80s, it could very well have been the same story just with different actors. And that's another thing. You would also definitely have different actors in the 60s. I didn't think about that, but Harrison Ford and Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher wouldn't have been old enough for the parts yet. And the only reason George Lucas knew Harrison Ford was because of American Graffiti. So, you'd have different actors. So, it'd be a very different movie from what we all know and love. But it'd likely still be successful, as you can tell from the other science fictions of the 60s. So, that is my opinion of what would happen if it came out in the 60s. And the reason I had 2001: Space Odyssey up on the screen instead of some Star Wars picture was because of the fact that was one of the many influences of Star Wars when it came out in 1977, and it paved the way for Star Wars. And since this episode dealt with the 1960s, and I was going to mention it some, I thought it'd be a more appropriate picture. So, sorry it's been a while since I came out with an episode, but hope you enjoyed. I'm hoping to get back to normal. My school work for the year is dying down. See you guys later.